So, just to explain, Mango's mission is to strengthen the financial management and accountability of NGOs. So, our take on this is really how to get NGOs to get more out of their money. That's what we want to see. And I think something that we've been concerned about since Mango was founded 12 years ago was the lack of integration between strategic decision-making, program decision-making, and financial decision-making. Often they occur in silos. So the NAO definition, which Martin referred to, is about optimal use of the resources you've got. And as he kind of describes, that's really common sense. It's about making better decisions, learning from what went wrong, learning from what went well, making a better decision the next time round. So in that sense, it's kind of nothing you can disagree with. But I think there are some real issues with how VFM is being applied to the NGO sector that we need to tease out. And then I think there are some practical approaches that Mango is starting to take with a few NGOs, which are very much in development. So I don't put these out as best practice or even good practice. It's emerging practice. And I want you to, ask questions and critique them. So the first thing I'd say is, fundamentally, you can't, I think, say that value for money is a kind of one-size-fits-all tool, because there's a real discontinuum between projects or even NGOs that are primarily around service provision and projects or even NGOs that are primarily around transforming power relations. These things are so different, but the way you apply value for money to them has got to be really different. So they're just not equal. So on one side, we've got very short-term kind of thinking, very defined project plans, log frames, etc. On the other, we've got very long-term thinking. And really, for transforming power relations, it's sustainability that we care about most. And that often can't be measured within a traditional evaluation. It happens a long time after that you can assess whether it's been sustainable or not. And the context is so vital when you're looking at power relations, whereas maybe a service provision project, you can be the same. If you're providing mosquito nets, it can be very similar in a different context. And of course, you've got much more control and certainty when you're doing service provision. You can basically quality manage all the way through the delivery chain. And when it comes to power relations, how can you ever really attribute it to you? So how are you going to ascribe, even if you can value that impact, how can you attribute it to your intervention? And what we see in service provision is that if you compare one agency with another, you get a lot of commonality between the inputs, the approaches, the outcomes. And that, of course, makes it a lot easier to do benchmarking. And benchmarking is a key component of how many organisations try and assess their value for money. But it's a lot easier on that kind of left-hand side. And so this is the nub of the problem, really, is that because of all these things, it's kind of a lot easier for donors to assess value for money when it's much more like service provision. And of course, value for money is partly about you buying a service. So you want to assess, is that good value, that service? So that really enters into the thinking, and the danger is that we'll drive more of the overall portfolio of both donor money and NGO activity into more service provision. And I've got a contention for you here, which is I actually think that it's easier for beneficiaries to measure when there's transforming power relations kind of change. This is the stuff that they can see. Because the service provision, it comes and it goes. But beneficiaries really understand when they're being empowered, when change is being brought about. They can measure it. So we've got this kind of measurement dilemma, which I think is at the heart of quite a lot of discussion. So Natsios from USAID said, the best projects, the most transformational, are the hardest to measure. But is that really true? The CEDA published a paper which Robert Chambers wrote the preface for, where if you use beneficiaries to assess whether empowerment's happening or whether change is happening, you can actually, one, get very valid and robust judgments that you can measure over time. You can aggregate it, because if you use scoring mechanisms, you can build up quantitative analysis of qualitative data. So you can actually measure this. And this is the stuff that really matters. So I just, jokingly would put out there, for yourselves, if you were to do a cost-benefit analysis of applying value for money to the NGO sector, what might you come up with? So there's a lot of time that ends up getting spent collecting data and plugging it into computers. And this takes time away from building relationships, working directly with communities. That's a big cost. There's this danger of useful-looking metrics popping out, like the cost per beneficiary. He was great. He was initially skeptical about it, but the problem is that these metrics get stuck. They get stuck in the discourse, so that everybody starts. I've seen it increasingly. A number of NGOs are now measuring cost per beneficiary, but there are so many assumptions made as to what the quality of that ultimate intervention with that single beneficiary is. How comparable really is it? And do we start creating indicators that become a shackle, if you like, to us? And as I said, it could lead to shorter-term thinking. And then, I don't know if people read the Bond Values and Frames paper that was brought out last year, which argued that the whole way the NGO sector is currently presenting itself to the British public is dangerous. And one of the dangers is that we are presenting aid and development as a transaction. You give us money, we bring about change. And this is fundamentally going to undermine our ability to bring about that change, because we need structural, power, dynamical change. Okay, sounds bad on the cost side, but believe it or not, I believe there are some benefits. So if we keep all of this in mind, we can get something out of this. So, as I said, integrating financial management into decision making can actually lead to better decision making and more value for beneficiaries. And if we understand our cost drivers, we do get better at cost control. And actually really understanding the whole way that value is created in NGOs does force us to focus on what we're best at, the relationships. And I think the one thing that I feel is totally new about the VFM agenda for NGOs is it really encourages deeper options analysis. Often we think there's only one way to do something, whereas VFM encourages you to look at viable different options. And sometimes we can spot new opportunities that we might have missed by doing that. So I'm probably taking more than my 10 minutes, so I'm going to speed up slightly. Just to say that this came from Oxfam actually, which is when you're thinking about the relative value of the different E's, and we use the 4 E's which the Independent Commission for Aid Impact came up with. It's equity that is by far the most important in terms of delivering value. And as you go down this triangle, they're probably going to yield less value. Whereas we spend a lot of time worrying about economy, it's going to probably deliver incrementally less real change to the ultimate value for money of what you do. So this is one of the tools that we've been using, which I wanted to share. And this is just in terms of decision making. So you can apply this at any level, whether it be in a project, at a country office, or in head office. And it's when it's taking a decision, try and think of these 3 dimensions. So how is quality being addressed by that decision? How is cost being addressed? And how is risk? And what we find that there's often an imbalance between how people look at these things. And VFM has this danger that we get biased towards cost. So we need to create more balance. We need to ensure that we've looked at these different aspects. So an example might be we looked at in an agency took a very corporate decision to sign up to the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership. But when it did it, it was motivated very rightly by programme quality decisions. But they hadn't thought at all about the costs of that and all the systems change that was needed. And so, because they hadn't thought about that right, they didn't implement it right. It took them many more years, probably, to get the systems in place to fulfil the aims of the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership than if they'd taken all these factors into account when making their decisions. And they hadn't thought of all the risks that this threw up to them as an organisation either. Okay, and then I want to just talk about benchmarking. So we're just starting on some benchmarking projects with NGOs now. And I think the key to this is going to be discovering the Rosetta Stone. So I don't know if people are familiar with the Rosetta Stone. So it was discovered in the 19th century, and it was the first time that we could understand ancient Egyptian, because on this one piece of stone there was ancient Egyptian at the top, then a translation of it into Demotic, and another translation into Greek. We understood Greek and Demotic, but so it gave us this code to suddenly understand Egyptian. So this is what we need for VFM, I think. So when we're doing our stakeholder analysis and beneficiary selection, our input, output, outcome chains, our output and outcome indicators, and our unit cost of inputs. We do that all the time in our own organisations, but of course every organisation does it differently. So when we're benchmarking, it's really difficult to actually compare like with like. So it's only going to work if we've got common enough contexts and beneficiaries. Comparing completely different contexts is not going to yield value to you if you're doing a benchmarking study. We've got to use common approaches. If our whole approach to the way we're delivering a program is going to be very different, you're not going to really get any learning or value out of benchmarking that either. But when we do that, we start to get the sharing of learning and good practice. When we're doing something similar but slightly different, that's when the learning is richest. And when we're looking at indicators, it's only going to work if there's a certain amount of commonality of those indicators. And there are a number of common indicators projects going on at the moment to develop data sets. And this is interesting because we will start to get some real rich data, which at the moment we probably don't have. And finally, unit costs of inputs. Well, again, if these are to be meaningful, we need to have common costing methodologies. So even though we've got things like the IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, they currently don't stipulate how you should actually end up costing things or allocating costs. So it's actually impossible to compare one set of financial reports to any other NGO in the sector, and SORP doesn't really help either. So if we're going to do benchmarking, I feel we need to put quite a lot of energy into this building a Rosetta Stone for ourselves that's going to work, that's going to yield real value. So I would suggest we start small and start with a few organisations that are very similar to ourselves and start to learn from the processes we get. So hopefully that's given you food for thought and lots of questions and critique of what I've said.